I think it is probably commonplace for people who start to grow rapidly in their lives, at whatever point, to experience a lot of difficulty from those around oneself. You might call it envy. You might just say they're stuck still while that other person is breaking free of his or her stuckness. Now, depending or not on one's religious views, there is all the same a very interesting verse in the Christian Bible. Mark 6:4 talks of this phenomenon, I believe, in a very interesting way. The New Living Translation puts it rather intelligibly, I believe, saying, "Then Jesus told them, 'A prophet is honored everywhere except in his own hometown and amongst his relatives and his own family.'" And I might add that by relatives we're also talking in-laws, who, in my opinion, sometimes might be more inclined to be a backseat driver, knowing that they have less to lose by making certain comments. Now, for those not religiously inclined, or thinking of the modern ages particularly, perhaps we ought to think, what is a prophet anyway? Maybe you might have called this person a very wise man. You might have called them a grandmother of a sort, or a very doting aunt or uncle. You might have also referred to them perhaps as a great president, perhaps, one to come along every few hundred years. Or you might think of them as a profound Native American Indian chief or other indigenous leader, wherever found. These might be called shamans, perhaps, or monks at times, also, or an occasional great minister. At any rate, I would say that this is a combination of factors, such as, in my opinion, having been highly loved, perhaps having grown up in a minimum of chaos, such as a very small village, farm life, etc. And they were probably well instructed in what you might call reading, writing, and arithmetic, such that they could think well and discern a variety of things as per sorting wheat from the chaff when it comes to people and ideas, thinking for yourself, if you will. And as having been loved quite well compared to many, Gabor Mate, Dr. Gabor Mate, talking of this phenomenon as a Canadian doctor, this might generate exceedingly high levels of empathy compared to many. And then combined with great acumen intellectually and freedom in terms of time on hand to observe, to ponder, to write things down, to discuss with people, to review. These then all contribute perhaps what we would call to a very wise person, or, as the scriptures in the Christian faith had talked of, a prophet. For instance, I once camped in Appalachia, eastern Kentucky, and I met a man who had at one time been a logger for a power company, and as a child he was raised by his grandparents, you might say in the sticks, low levels of chaos, lots of time on hand. And he told me he learned so much by observing animals as to how people behave and motives, desires. This by observing, noting to other people I know who tout this quite a bit, the philosopher Schopenhauer. Whatever weaknesses he may have had, of course, we all have them. And then the minister slash newspaperman slash lawyer, Russell Conwell, who wrote several books of noteworthiness, I believe, such as Every Man His Own University and Acres of Diamonds. Both heavily touted observing, and Schopenhauer also touted highly mathematical acumen, skill, and linguistics. In my opinion, linguistics being the ability to use words not just to describe things succinctly, but not to offend others, to describe things with respect conveyed to people. Hence, linguistics in that manner. Now, all of these things then combined are not, I believe, very common. Hence, they're being called, when optimally combined, like a great recipe, a prophet, a wise man, a very perceptive person, a person of wisdom. Now, I would say in younger years, there might be a combination of factors playing out all too common with such a person. First, they may not get many compliments as to their special skills and wisdom. And secondly, they may be envied by some people for the freedoms they have when so many others, maybe parents, townspersons, and relatives, feel so much the more stuck and wish they were like that child. Additionally, the child may have mimicked a certain person who was highly loving toward them, or just gravitated toward this concept of not wanting to use words that hurt other people. And in my opinion, almost all words doing so. Hence, people like a John Brahm, a leading Buddhist in the world today, heading up a monastery in the area of Perth, Australia, talking of how for many people it's best not to think too much, lest their cultural programming influence them in a negative direction. And in my view, this cultural influence being especially related to the words they learned. He says thus that, in his opinion, thinking is best reserved to the enlightened person, whatever you might construe that to mean. In my book, maybe we're talking again the wise person as they get on in years, or this so-called prophet. Now, the spiritual man Ram Dass also talks of this concept when he says that sometimes it's best just not to say too much. Now, that's, of course, presuming that one has fine intellectual talents to analyze things, first of all. I remember reading once a book by Dr. Richard Carlson. One of the books he had written was Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, and It's All Small Stuff. But at any rate, I remember once saying that things are often not figure-outable, and as a case example, he gave that he can't figure out his own children, and that if he can't do that, what's the point? But then I might add, how much strong mathematical talent did he have that Schopenhauer, for instance, was urging us to have? Noting that I have a book on my shelf entitled The Dumbest Generation Ever. Maybe, in fact, with all the technology these days, we're all too often using it as assembly line operators to know procedures to execute, like punching buttons on a calculator to add things, rather than using mathematics for more abstract thinking, more complex thinking, than would be the case by what I refer again to the concept being assembly line work, regardless of a degree level involved, and the job title too, and the pay and prestige perhaps. So such a person then, not wanting to use toxic words, might find themselves at a disadvantage when it comes to making his way in the world, to include winnowing people sorting the wheat from the chaff, his not wanting to use or her use terms that stir up anger, bitterness, blame, and so on. And so you might say all too often they keep getting taken over and over and over. This was in fact the case for Lincoln, one of our former presidents, who had a number of business failures, including one or more partners who took him to the cleaners, basically. Same for Gandhi the lawyer, who was not a very good lawyer starting off. But he got a lot better. And as per Lincoln, he got to the point in his capacity as a lawyer where he rarely lost a case because he's so well prepared to understand both sides before entering the courtroom. And Lincoln's honor, it was said, or honesty and perceptivity as time went on, was noted to the point where he was often called at this and that gathering to be a judge to adjudicate matters of discrepancy between two people. But this took time, and perhaps in part because it took time perhaps to develop their vocabulary set that was going to be respectful to winnow people and not see thus everybody as the same or just operate according to feelings, intuition, if you will. I would maintain then a key point in all of this is that such a person without the acumen, the skill to discern, to winnow people, might in childhood or earlier life be considered rather naive and subject to a lot of using by some people. Scapegoating, baiting, what you might call bullying, being deceived quite often. But perhaps at a certain point in time, the person refines their vocabulary set more and more, remembers the accumulated experiences of life more and more, and starts to put two and two together. And at this time, they begin the process, sometimes rapid, I believe, of breaking free. Some have called it to stop denying certain things, maybe even one thing, or to break free of a logjam, as Shin talked of in the 1920s. Or you might call it, did I mention, a limiting belief exposed. Or Christo saying that delusions are lies we tell ourselves, and some say delusions are simply denials. As this person then starts to break free of their former incapacity to, shall we say, winnow or take care of themselves in certain rough and tumble situations, to include with those who know the person best, their family, their town, as per the verse in the Bible, then interesting things start to happen, I believe. This person typically being what you might call a scapegoat all too often, or a chronic person bullied, so to speak, although not usually hit. As the process evolves then, seems to me the tables turn. And the person once considered weak with derision and used to displace anger, call it sadism in a way, this whole table starts to flip on end. And the people once doing the so-called scapegoating or utilizing of the person for their own ends, including discharging anger upon the person, or simply gossiping about the person, regarding them as trivial, all of a sudden the tables are turned in that this talked of, by the way, in a variety of videos. The persons doing this are found out. They're exposed. And they feel very sheepish, ashamed, and they wish to go back to the status quo, and it's not probably going to be possible. The person thus formerly being dumped on, if you will, a term used by John Brahm, the monk in Australia, is breaking free then of their slave status, I would say, as per being a handy target. I think even of that advertisement, give it to Mikey, he'll eat anything. Or the adage that somebody has a kick me sign on their back and doesn't know it. What happens when they discover there's a kick me sign there, and who's been doing it? Within their own family and town, for expedient reasons, and they pluck that thing off and see what has been happening. Now all of a sudden then the slave roles are reversed, perhaps. The slave has become much less of a slave, much more free, and the people who are enslaving the person are exposed as enslaved themselves. There being at least one video I watched regarding a woman, perhaps 80, who was once in a Nazi concentration camp. She went back, maybe talked with some people who had once been guards, and her conclusion was that the people who had guarded her in the camp were in a worse prison than herself, a mental prison. This pointed out, by the way, I believe too, by a former psychologist, Dr. Sean Stephenson, before his death around the age of 40. I think then this has a whole lot to do with the words in Mark 6:4, depending on whether one has any kind of faith or not, or likes to read scriptures or not. When it says a prophet, or I would say a person considerably broken free, Buddhists might even say the pinnacle being what they call enlightenment, although I've seen way too many people claim to be enlightened who were far from optimized, if you will. At any rate, honored everywhere except in his, or I might say her, hometown and amongst his relatives and his own family. Wouldn't it be interesting to speculate rather strongly that these are precisely the people most likely to be scapegoating that person in the first place, and to be quite uncomfortable when found out? And by scapegoating, I mean several things, like displacing anger upon the person, and the person not being able to discern wheat from the chaff as to who's more helpful, more empathetic, versus more manipulative, more destructive, until they grow up, so to speak. Thus, this flipping of the table is most uncomfortable and resulting in what you might call colossal rejection or blowback or great difficulties for a time, if not more than a time. As opposed to those who see someone coming on the scene, whether the movies scene, the book scene, the TV scene, what have you, and somebody never having known the person very well in their childhood, and furthermore, not having participated in utilizing this person for their own means that wasn't so peachy keen. Maybe this helps a little bit to reframe things, and why sometimes when we suddenly start to meteorically grow, if we do, seems that family members, relatives outside the nuclear family, whatever, and the town itself, if still in that town and they knew you when you were younger or for a period of time, makes for most difficult conditions. Something to ponder anyway. This is somewhat speculative, but seems to have a smack of truth to it.